So we're moving on to key element number 2. As you have discovered from key element number 1, you can't really disconnect these two elements. That loving people, knowing people, assumes that you get information from these people. That's the wrong slides. And I think not only is loving people assuming you know something, assuming you're getting data from them, you're getting knowledge from them, you're trying to understand them, but how you do that is also important as well. And this is part of the skill of, I think, asking questions in a way that doesn't seem like you're an FBI interrogator, but you really are a friend who wants to love them and help them. And so, yes, you must know something, but even how you come about that knowledge and how you approach that knowledge is also important as well. All right, well, I went too far. So the first slide just said you can't ever have too many questions. Dr. Vanderweer likes to say, ask 100 questions and then ask 100 more questions. That you really want to survey the landscape. You don't want to make assumptions. You want to turn over every possible rock. Not because it's just on your to-do list, but because you want to really understand that person. The last thing you want to do is to begin to speak or to begin to give counsel when you have not first understood the person. And this is where, rightly or wrongly, biblical counseling has maybe been caricatured or gotten a bad rap, is that we're just hammering people with truth all the time. That ought not to be the case. We certainly are bringing truth to the table. We're not just asking questions, but we perceive that the questions come before the delivery of truth because we can't ultimately speak unless we understand what exactly we're speaking to. Now, Hebrews 4, we've already alluded to this a handful of times already, that Jesus is the fact-finding creator, that he has come down, and Hebrews 4 says that he sympathizes with us, that he knows us in a very, very intimate way. Now, we could spend the rest of the day really talking about the incarnation of Christ. But think about this. You had a debt that you owed God. And in God's providence and sovereignty, He could have paid off that debt maybe in a number of different ways. At the end of the day, the Bible's pretty clear that the death of a perfect man, who was also God, was required to pay for our sin. But at the end of the day, God didn't just write a check and send it in the mail to pay the debt. He came himself to the earth that he created to save the people that he also created. And according to Colossians 1, that he upholds the universe by his very breath, and he entered that universe in order to save us. And so if you read Instruments, he talked a lot about incarnating yourself into people's life as being like Jesus, of coming down into where people are. And this isn't, again, it's not just on the checklist. It's just not a key element number 2. It's not just something that we do on our way of counseling. It assumes a certain predisposition, a disposition. So what is the disposition of God? God is one of mercy and kindness and compassion and understanding and humility. And by very nature, we must be the same. That you actually won't be a very good data gatherer. You won't actually do well gathering knowledge if you don't have the disposition of humility and kindness just like Jesus had. Now, consider this. The Bible is clear that Jesus was 100% God and 100% human. That Jesus was born as an infant. So for those of us who have small children at home, my 3-year-old never faces a temptation that Jesus himself did not face as a 3-year-old. That Jesus learned how to speak, Jesus learned how to count, and wrap your brain around that a little bit. This is the God who actually put the order of mathematics into the universe, who actually put the order of language into the universe, who himself spoke and it came into existence, is now learning speech and mathematics and so on and so forth. And so at every stage of life, we can never say, Jesus doesn't understand us. He understands the 1-year-old. He understands the baby in the womb. He understands you and I. He understands what it is to be betrayed. He understands what it is to be hungry and tired and sick. He understands these things. And so likewise, we ought not to be sitting across the table or whatever it is from somebody and be in a position where we aren't at least seeking to understand who they are, where they are, and the things they're going through. Now, oftentimes, we will say things like, well, they're just a boy, or well, they're just 3, or well, they're just a teenager, or well, they're just this, or well, they're just that. Which, translate that for me. That basically means, they're not accountable for what they're doing. They really shouldn't be held to account for what they're doing. So whatever stage of life they're in, there's never a time, one, that they are not responsible for what they're doing, but there's also never a time that they can't look to God, look to Jesus, and be understood no matter what their sufferings or what their struggles may be, that He sympathizes with us in our weakness. Now, also, before I move on from Hebrews 4, there's 2 truths there, right? That He sympathizes with us, yet He was without sin. Now, I've been to some group therapy classes, maybe you have too, and what basically happens is, depending upon the context, you have, a professional therapist who facilitates the group circle, and it's basically, let's sit around and talk about how broken and empty and terrible our lives is, and then we can sort of pat each other on the back and encourage each other. And there's something to that. There's something to the fact that the world understands empathy. In fact, I would say the thing that the secular counseling does really well is they empathize really well, most of the time. They really do seek to sympathize and empathize with people. So you go to a group session, we all sit in a circle, and we just empathize with each other. And that's good, but we all walk away, and all we did was empathize with each other. The beauty about Jesus is He doesn't just empathize with you, He's actually defeated and conquered your problem. He understands your problem, but He actually has a solution for your problem. So, yes, we want to understand, yes, we want to empathize, but that doesn't mean that we aren't ultimately pointing them to some sort of solution, which again is ultimately found in Christ. So Jesus knew, ultimately, what was in man. He knew what was in the heart of man. And He demonstrates this again and again and again. And a good example of this is Jesus when He's dealing with the woman at the well. And if you walk through the context, it's very interesting how she says certain things, and then He says something else, and then she says something else. And at the whole time, Jesus is intentionally directing the conversation somewhere where He knows it needs to go. He knows what her ultimate problem is. She ultimately has a heart problem. She ultimately has a misunderstanding of God, and He knows what the issue is. And so He does listen, He does entertain her, but He doesn't get sidetracked. He doesn't allow her to dominate the conversation. And so in our data gathering, in our finding the facts, and our understanding people, you'll come across people who like to talk a lot, and that's okay, but you can't allow those people to dictate and dominate where the conversation ultimately ends. And so we have to learn the skill of bringing them back to, like Jesus did, what is the most important information that we need to be dealing with and discussing. So in Mark 10, you have what's called the rich young ruler. He comes to Jesus, and he asks one question. What's the question that he asks? How can I have eternal life? That's a great question to ask. But he comes asking that question already assuming or wanting a certain answer. And what's the answer he gets? Yeah, basically the answer is, here's a test to see what's in your heart. Now, we can do this in counseling through things like projects for growth, through things like giving them things that they ought to go and do, and then when they come back and how they've done that, and why they've done that, and when they've done that, we can help them see what maybe was going on in their hearts. But a test will reveal one's heart. So he was testing this man and said, okay, you want eternal life? Here's the test. Let's see if you really want eternal life. At the end of the day, what he wanted was his own righteousness, his own ticket, and he wasn't actually willing to do what Jesus was asking him to do in order to get eternal life. Now, there was a time where I was counseling this couple, and one of the issues, amongst many issues, was it was over their relationship together, over sex. So the man wanted more, and the wife wanted less, and the man actually was like daily sending her blogs and YouTube videos of Christian counselors, telling her how she ought to give her husband what he wants, because that's what the Bible says. You just give him everything he wants, right? So we're walking through this, and I'm introducing this idea of heart idolatry, and he's kind of, rebelling the whole way and wanting to sort of, well, I need this. What's wrong with this? God says this is a good thing, and I needed this, and it's just over and over and over again. So I finally came to the point where I said, okay, let's just imagine for a moment. Let's say that tonight, in your dreams, God comes to you, and he says to you, for whatever reason, I never want you to have sex again in the rest of your life. How would you respond to that? You know that's what God's telling you to do. What would you do then? And so he stops and he thinks he knows what the right answer is. But the point is that revealed to him, it was an aha moment for him because he realized what I'm saying is I have to have this, not only to live, but I have to have this in order to be happy, in order to follow God, in order to do this and that. This is a prerequisite for me in order to do something else. And so a test, like Jesus often used with people, will reveal what's actually in their heart. And so as we're communicating with people, as we're giving projects, this whole time, they're telling us something about what's going on in their thinking, in their motives, in their desires. They're always communicating to us. The question is, are we listening? Are we observant? In the old days, we would call it halo data. Halo data is a term that biblical counselors used to use to talk about things like body language. If you're doing marriage counseling, are they holding hands? Are they sitting across the room from each other? Are they laughing at each other? How are they interacting with each other? This will communicate something to you about them, about their marriage, and are we paying attention? Are we listening? Now, in addition, though, we have to be careful because some people, and I found especially people who've been to multiple counselors, the first question that they want to know is what's my problem? Tell me what to do about my problem. What's my problem? And they want you to diagnose them and treat them right there on the spot. And even though you might have a good idea about what might actually be going on in their heart, you have to be careful with that. Because if the first thing you say to them, well, here's your problem and here's the solution, who are they depending upon? You. So it's not just you seeing their problem, it's you helping them see that's their problem through the lenses of the Scriptures. You want to walk them down the aisle, as it were, and bring them to the throne room of grace and show them, here is what's going on in your heart, and here is the solution. Because typically, these kinds of folks, they're just surveying people. They're going to everybody they know, and they're saying, what do you think the problem is? What do you think the problem is? What do you think I should do? And you're just one more person in the chain. So you want to break that chain, and you want to point them back to the ultimate source of truth, which is God himself. So even though we do have answers, we want to be careful how we come about giving those answers and making sure we're not having them depend upon us, but upon the Lord. So ultimately, we are seeking to meet the need of the person in front of you. In other words, and this might sound a little tricky here, as we've talked about needs before, what need did Jesus know this man had? He had a spiritual need, right? He had a heart issue. So Jesus was discerning this. He's asking him questions. He's giving him things to do. And as the man responds to him, he's evaluating what's going on in this guy's heart. And through that, he's seeing, here's what the real need is in front of you. So when we're walking with people, you might see what you think their need might be. But you have to be careful and slow how you come to that conclusion, because as they begin to respond to the sessions together, to counseling, to projects, you're going to see more and more and more and more what might actually be happening in their hearts. The key, though, in fact, what I really like when we do, OIC has a specific form that you fill out and you send back to your supervisor. So like if you were doing supervised counseling with Andrew, ACBC has a particular form you'd fill out and you'd send back to Andrew. OIC kind of has their own form. But there's a question on that form that I really like, because the question is, what desires of the heart did the counselee realize they had? It isn't asking, what do you see? It's asking, what are they seeing? And the question is really, how are you helping them see the problem, as opposed to you just telling them what the problem is? One, because you want to be careful not to make assumptions, and two, at the end of the day, you want them relying upon the Lord, not just on you. And that doesn't negate wise and godly counsel. So, as we saw in building the relationship, if you read Instruments in the Redeemer's Hands, you see that Paul Tripp used this term called permanent casual relationships. And he basically said what we do often, especially in the Christian life, is we build these sort of surface-level relationships. And these are the relationships that we live and we function in. And so how, at the end of the day, could we actually apply any of the principles we're talking about if all we're ever in is these permanent casual relationships? So tomorrow, if you go to a church gathering and you see somebody, hey, how you doing? I'm good, That's okay. I'm not saying don't do that. But if that's all it ever is, what would be some better questions? Yeah, and again, it would assume that you actually have a relationship with this person. Hey, what have you been struggling with this week? What are some encouraging things that happened this week? What have you been reading in the Word this week? How have you been applying? Last Sunday, the sermon was over this. How's that been working out in your life this week? Hey, 2 weeks ago, you told me you're really anxious about this situation at work. Last week, the passage was Philippians 4, and we were talking about, renewing your mind with truth and thinking about true things and right things and holy things. And were you able to do that this week? So we're pushing ourselves past these casual relationships, assuming, again, that we actually have a disposition that is seeking to love people, engage with people, and actually cares and listens to people. So we need to go beyond just communication techniques to a disposition of humility, a disposition of Christ-likeness. Again, if you take secular counseling classes, they'll give you all kinds of techniques on how to ask questions and how to engage people and how to do these things, and some of which are good and okay. But what they're not teaching you about is actually how to have a disposition of Christ-likeness. One, because they don't believe in Christ. So it's not just, here's some techniques. No, unless you're humble, unless your heart is transformed, the way that you deal and approach people isn't ultimately going to happen. So Tripp gives reasons why we have these casual relationships. One of them is we think we're unique, which either leads us to withdraw from people or actually to see ourselves as above people. We're blind to our own sin, so we haven't actually seen our own sin in our hearts. And I would say this is probably the biggest reason, is we just don't ask. We just don't ask. So if you ask somebody tomorrow morning, how was your week this week? And they said, oh, it was okay. There was just a situation at work. And you could leave it there, or you could say, oh, tell me about what's going on at work. What's happening at work? What's the situation at work? And as they begin to talk, they're saying things like, well, it was really frustrating. All right, what was frustrating about it? Well, my boss is this, and this. Okay, well, tell me about your boss. And you're walking through this, and you're pursuing, and you're not just making assumptions or not asking at all, but you're continuing to pursue them and walk through this. Now, every time somebody says something, you ought to be learning something about that person. How they say something will tell you something about that person. How you doing, brother? I'm doing all right. That tells you something. How you doing, brother? Doing good. That tells you something. Every time every time you look at somebody, they're telling you something. The question is, what are they telling you? Are you able to read what they're saying? And again, don't just assume you know. When I asked you how you were doing, you weren't exactly convincing when you said you were doing good. Are you really doing good? How's it going? What's going on with this or that or this thing? So we are listening for facts. Turn to Proverbs 18. If you use a paper Bible, this would be a good chapter just to earmark. The whole chapter is full of wisdom on engaging with people. Let's just walk through some of these passages. Verse 2. A fool. What's a fool characterized by the way? Yeah, a fool is ultimately not submitting themselves to God. Takes no pleasure in understanding. The reason why he doesn't take pleasure in understanding is because he's a fool. And he's a fool because he doesn't take pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. You and I have all been in situations where we had something that we really wanted to work through, and the minute we opened our mouth, we were interrupted and somebody just gives us their opinion. In our culture, we are experts at sharing our opinion. If you go out of here and you turn on any secular radio station, you wait 10 minutes, you're going to hear somebody's opinion about some topic. So, we want to be careful, one, at listening and understanding, and two, not just dispersing our opinion. And I will often be very careful when somebody asks me something. If they're literally saying, can you give me your opinion on this? I'll say, okay, here's how I would get there. Here are the principles that I would take, here's how I would use them, and here's where I would arrive. But I want you to understand this is just my opinion. This is how I would work through that. But I'm also giving them the system that I'm using to work through that. I'm not just saying, oh yeah, here's what you should do, or here's what I think about that. Because at the end of the day, that just sets them up to running from person to person to person to person, surveying people's opinion. That's not what we're after. Verse 4, the words of a man's mouth are deep waters. The fountain of wisdom is a bubbling brook. Verse 13, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. What is the disposition of the person who gives an answer before he hears? What does he assume about himself? He already knows. I don't need any information. I already know it all. He's not understanding the person. He's not seeking God's wisdom. He's just spitting out his own rhetoric. So it's not just, okay, I need to listen, I need to listen, I need to listen, I need to listen. It is a disposition that I understand I don't know everything. I'm not omnipresent. I'm not omniscient. I don't understand every single circumstance. It is folly and shame to this person. Verse 15, an intelligent heart. Can your heart be intelligent? Yes. And your heart can be foolish. An intelligent heart acquires. What does that word acquire mean? At least in my translation. What does acquire mean? Yeah, you're seeking after it. You're pursuing it. You're going out of your way to find it. You're listening for it. And the ear of the wise seeks, pursues, goes after knowledge. Now think about, in your life, the difference between a time where somebody interrupts you and just gives you their opinion, as opposed to the time where somebody actually listens to you, draws you out, tries to understand you. Not only is that person now have actually the right data to be able to speak wisely into your life, but what is your feeling towards that person? Yeah, you automatically think, well, this person cares about me. They're actually interested in me. I actually want to share more with them because they're clearly trying to understand me. They're trying to draw out my heart. They're trying to help me. Listen actively for all the facts. This would particularly come into play when you're doing things like marriage counseling, because typically there's two different sets of facts going on. So when the husband says she's just this, this, and this, and this, First thing I do is say, wife, is that true? No, that's not true. It's this, this, and this, and this. Husband, she says this, this, and this. Is that true? And we try to understand what is actually happening, what is actually going on in the midst of that circumstance. And to, again, leave no rock unturned. Tell me about what your day is like. Sometimes I'll have people do just a time journal. I want to know what their time is like in 15 or 30-minute increments. So you're stressed out all the time. You're struggling with anxiety. Tell me what your day's like. What are you doing? Okay, I'm doing this, this, and this every 30 minutes. Okay, now I get it. Now when you're doing that, tell me what the circumstances are like. What are you thinking? What's going on when you're doing this or when you're doing that? I'm trying to understand what's going on in their life. So I'm listening for all the data. Now, Dr. Vanderweer tells a story about when he was working on one of his doctorates, there was a church that was close to the school who asked him to come on and be on like a temporary staff to help them with some of their counseling load. And so he did, and he met with the pastor, and the pastor said, there's a particular case we want you to begin with. And he's like, okay, what's the case? Well, there's a lady who came in for counseling, and she only met with the counselor 2 times, and then she quit counseling. I said, okay, why did she quit counseling? Well, apparently the lady had come in, and the lady had listened to her for about 15 minutes. It was lady counselor, lady, and the lady had listened to her for 15 minutes. And she said, okay, here's your problem. Here's some projects. Go and do them. That was it. Okay, so she said, okay, I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to go do the project. So she goes do the project. She comes back. The lady didn't even look at the projects and just, okay, here's what you need to do. Here's some more projects. Go and do them. So the lady, frustrated, just quit. So Dr. Vanderweer meets with her the first time in like a coffee shop, public setting situation, and he said the first session, she talked for an hour and a half straight. He said, okay, ma'am, I've got to go now. Thanks for sharing with me. They met the second time, talked for another hour and a half. Met the third time, talked another hour and a half. Fourth time, talked 30 minutes, and then said, okay, can you help me? So that's 5 hours if you're doing the math. So for 5 hours, she sort of did an unbreak speech. She spoke for 5 hours straight, and Dr. Vanderweer listened to her for 5 hours straight. Now, that may be a unique situation. It may not be your situation, but there's some people who literally have gone their whole life and nobody has ever listened to them. And if they're coming to us as people who are supposed to know the Lord and supposed to point them to the Lord, the last thing we want to do and be are the people who do not listen to them or give them some sort of cheap, shallow counsel. We want to listen. We want to understand. So turn to page, 27 in your notes. And Andrew referred to this earlier. That here is a formal form that we use. Now, I don't always use this form. Depending upon the person, again, I sort of do lots of informal and formal counseling. If it's informal, I don't use this form. However, I'll still in my mind circle through some of these questions. This is basically a 50,000 flyover view of somebody's life. It's giving you a snapshot of their history. It's giving you a snapshot of their medical issues. It's giving them a snapshot of their family situations. It's giving you a snapshot of some basic struggles they may be having. And so what I do, if somebody wants to meet with me, I'll say, okay, 2 things. 1, I have a waiver form you need to sign. It says what we are actually going to be doing together, and you need to sign off on that. And 2, I have them fill this out. I would probably say 30-40% of the time, it never comes back. And I never meet with the person. What does that tell you about somebody? Yeah, they're not committed. They won't even fill out, a 5-page form about themselves. So at the end of the day, okay, they're not ready to be a counselee. They're not ready to receive counsel. But this is a form that's going to give you a snapshot. So what I do is I say, you got to fill this out. You send it to me. Once you send it to me, then we'll schedule our first session. Because I want to know, A, are they committed? And B, I want to see something about them before we start to meet. Because when I walk into the first session, I've already read through this. I prayed through some issues. I have a direction in mind I want to go. I have a whole list of questions I want to ask. Okay, you marked here that you have a distant relationship with your father. Tell me about that. You marked here that you've been divorced or whatever the issue is. Tell me about that. So I have a whole list of questions that I want to follow up on during that first meeting. I might even, depending upon what the issue is, I might already send them a couple projects to work on before they come to the first meeting, which again is giving me data. So even before I walk into the first meeting, they've already done this for me, they've already done projects and sent them to me, and I've got a whole lot of data that I can now work through with them before we even meet the first time. Particularly like in a marriage counseling situation, I want both couples to tell me, what do you see to be the top 5 problems? What do you see to be the top 5 problems? Okay, I walk in knowing, here's what she's saying, here's what he's saying, then I want to follow up and say, you said this, what does that mean? You said this, where does that happen? When does that happen? Why do you see this? And I've already got all this information before we even walk through the doors. So, also though, when you look through this, you want to not make assumptions. You want to be very detailed and careful when they say something, what does it say? And even how they fill this out will tell you something. Now, turn to page 31. I only have I think 3 or 4 questions I asked. We have 5 here on page 31. Now, these are the questions that I will use without exception with any kind of counseling. I'm not saying I'll send somebody a form, but if it's just informal, first thing I'm going to say is, why do you want to meet with me? What's been going on? What have you been doing about this problem? You know what the number one answer is? Been praying about it. What do you want to know? How have you been praying about it? Are you praying a James 4 kind of prayer, Lord, give me what I want? Or are you praying a Jesus kind of prayer, Lord, if not your will? So how have you been praying? How long have you been praying? When have you been praying? What have you been praying? So I want to know, what have you done about it? And when people come to you, sometimes they're very hopeless because they feel like they've tried a lot and it's all failed. This is going to tell you up front, what have they actually tried? And you might immediately see, oh, okay, I see why they feel like they've really tried everything, but we can see already some holes in how they've been approaching their problems. 3 is a good question. Where did you learn that those actions might help you? This is one of those questions, where are these ideas originating from? Why do you think, essentially, these are going to be solutions for you? What makes you think these are going to be probable solutions? Number 4, what would you like us to do? In other words, what are your expectations of our time together? What are your expectations of me? Do you think I have a magic wand? Do you think we're going to do cognitive behavioral therapy? Do you think it's just going to be you letting it off your chest? What do you think is going to happen? What are you expecting? Number 5, what are you willing to do to get this problem solved? The best answer, the answer I always love to see, is whatever it takes. That's not always the answer you get. But when you look at this, if you have somebody fill this out, if there's 3 words on each question, that tells you something. Sometimes you'll get back a packet of 10 pages. This person wants you to know how much they're hurting, how much they're struggling, and that's telling you something. So no matter what they answer, how they answer, the things they say, all of those things tell you something. And you want to make sure you don't make assumptions, you don't assume that you share definitions, and you want to make sure you follow up and you ask questions. Now, I was actually, ACBC, a couple weeks ago, actually had a podcast on data gathering. And Dr. John Street, who's the president of the board, I think, Andrew, is that right? Of the ACBC board, he was actually on there talking about counseling, and he was talking about, again, not making assumptions. And he was given a situation where he was counseling this couple, and they were having conflict and so forth, and the wife was actually accusing the husband of abuse. And so he just assumed that she was telling the truth, and they were working through that, and then a few weeks later, they had this fight. She called the cops. She told the cops that he had abused her, beaten her, whatever. He got arrested. He was in jail for 6 months. At the end of that time, this lady was convicted that she had lied about this whole situation. She called the police, told them what she had been lying, that this didn't actually happen. The police wouldn't believe her. She thought she was having, the reporter remorse or whatever you call it. And so he spent 6 months in jail. And so as John Street is reflecting on that, he just assumed She's not, he didn't follow up and ask questions like, okay, tell me about when this is happening. Tell me about where this is happening. What are the effects of this? What are you fighting over? Has anybody else ever seen this? He just assumed, and at the end of the day, it ended up with this, this guy spending 6 months in jail. Now, every time Andrew tells the Carl Rogers joke, I don't think anybody else gets it but me. So does everybody know who Carl Rogers is? Okay, Carl Rogers was a psychologist who came up with the Rogerian theory of counseling that is very prominent in our culture today, which is the idea of reflective therapy. You're just asking questions, you're helping them, right? You assume the solution's in here, and you're just working through this. Well, there's a predominant seminary in California that practices this theory, and for the first year, when they come in, they have to start counseling people, which I think is a good thing. But what they tell them is, for the first year, you're not allowed to give any counsel. You're not allowed to say anything. You just listen. You just reflect. You just ask questions. So we are not saying getting data, gathering facts is that. You are certainly listening. You are certainly trying to understand the person, but there comes a point where you turn the corner and you begin to point them to God's Word, even to help gather more data. So if somebody's coming into you and they're saying, I'm struggling with anger, let's go somewhere in the Bible and say, okay, tell me what you think anger is. Tell me what this is saying anger is, and let's walk through this together. In that, you're not only giving them truth, but you're also gathering data. You're also understanding. If you say to somebody, let's go to the Bible, and they immediately roll their eyes at you, that communicates something to you about them. You've got some work to do there. So, how do we gather facts beyond just these formal settings? We talked about the 5 questions. Formally, again, the worksheet there. Just by the way, depending on what kind of situation you're in, and honestly, for me, it depends on where I'm at, but in most situations, formal or informal, I want to have some way to take notes. Because it is important to me what they're saying, and I don't want to misunderstand what they're saying, and I don't want to forget what they're saying. So if they say something to me, I want to write it down, and I want to play it back to them and say, okay, you said earlier, when you're a child, your father used to speak to you this way, and it made you feel this way. Do I understand that correctly? You said in your marriage, your husband always does this. By always, do you mean this or do you mean this? I want to understand what they're saying. So almost in any situation, I want to have the ability to take notes of some kind so I can reflect upon the session, so I can make sure I'm hearing them and understanding them, and I want to be able to play things back to them. So informally, good questions, and then the question becomes, what do we do with these facts? So, we differentiate between the what and the why, the outer man and the inner man stuff. And this isn't always easy to do. So, if we're thinking about outer man and inner man stuff, the difference between what and why, what would be the what stuff? If you're thinking about the tree diagram, what would be the what stuff? Say it again. Circumstances. The circumstances is the what. Now, we've said over and over and over and over again, the heat is not the problem, the heart is the problem. That does not mean that the heat is not important, because the heat tells us something. It shows us, it points us to the heart. So I want to know in great detail about the what. I want to know when, I want to know how, I want to know where, I want to know how long, I want to know who is involved, I want to know what you did, I want to know what you said, I want to know what you thought, I want to know what you felt. I want to know all the what stuff. Because that what stuff is going to help me then get to and help them get to the why stuff, the inner man stuff that is going on. So I want to make sure that I do this. Now, when we are asking these questions, we want to make sure we are direct in asking our questions. We don't want to make assumptions. We want to make sure that we're turning over every rock. So, for example, in marriage counseling, What will happen is oftentimes one spouse is going to blame the other spouse of something. He always does this because he's so selfish and all he cares about is himself and he just wants to watch football all day. Well, she just said a mouthful there, but I want to chase down everything that she just said. Okay, you said he wants to watch football all day or all the time. What do you mean by that? Like he does it on Sunday afternoons? He's recording games and he's watching it every day? I want to say to the husband, is this true? Are you always watching video game or football games? What are you doing? Because there's a big difference in that information. I want to make sure I understand exactly what she's saying. And I want to help them also ask good questions, help them understand each other, and ask better questions of one another. So the fact-finding fits in the model. We are at number 2. So we're trying to understand the circumstances, and we're trying to understand their responses to their circumstances, and that will then move us then lower down into their hearts. So when that happened, what did you say? What did you do? How did you feel? Where did you go? What was your response to that circumstance? And as we begin to move into pointing them to some godly solutions, what I'll often do is say, okay, if we could go back to last Saturday, when you guys were having this conflict and this fight over this thing, and you responded this way and this way and this way and this way, and you were thinking this, this, and this, and you were feeling this, this, and this, if we could go back, how would we change that? How would we start at the heart and move our way out into fruit? What would that look like? If you could replay it, how would that look? And remember that people live in the level of feelings. So as Andrew was talked about earlier, as you might ask them, what were they thinking? Most people don't know. Most people haven't thought about what they're thinking. They haven't learned to be self-reflective, and that's part of the process of gathering data and asking questions. As you're asking this question, you're helping them understand. You're helping them think. You're helping them reflect. Oh, I guess I was thinking this. Or even sometimes when I'll say, okay, you said this. If you said this, that would seem to imply that you'd be thinking something like this. And they'll say, oh, yeah, I guess it does. I've never thought about that before. So what you're doing is you're helping people understand how are they actually thinking, because where they're living is they're living in their feelings. They feel angry, they feel anxious, they feel sad, they feel these things, but those feelings are coming from somewhere. So if you have a husband that says, my wife makes me so mad. I was screaming at her because she doesn't respect me. What is he saying? Translate that. What's the what and what's the why? What's the what of his circumstance? His response would be screaming, but the circumstance, his wife isn't respecting him. So his wife isn't respecting him. His thorny response is he's yelling, and he's saying what? The problem's not in here. The problem's out there. The problem's her. When he doesn't understand, the reason why he's screaming is he is actually made respect an idol. He's lifted that above God. He's willing to sin against his wife in order to get respect. And again, we have to be careful that we understand carefully the inner man, the outer man issues. So we're not medical doctors. We don't do medical tests. This is why we're asking, when's the last time you've been to the doctor? What did the doctor find? What tests did they run? What did they know? You want to understand what's going on with them physically, but at the end of the day, you're not a medical doctor. However, you want to take into account what are their physical issues. We talked about the guy who had diabetes. That's important for you to know. If you walk out of here and you hit your leg on the table when you get up, is that going to affect you? So you get up, you hit your leg on the table, and I immediately come in and say, hey, man, how you doing? That's going to change how you're responding, right? Now, it's not going to determine your response, but nonetheless, we want to understand, what are your sleeping patterns like? What's your diet like? Do you ever exercise? You want to understand all these things. It's going to help you understand what's going on with the person and how to help them. Okay, we are going to now move into working on key element number 2 in the context of our case study. So I want you to reform in your groups. You're going to go to your case study now. Go ahead and skip to page... We're going to introduce this in defining the problem, but go to page 37 quickly. Here is the whole plethora of questions that we introduced to you yesterday with the x-ray questions. I gave you about 6 of them yesterday. Here's a whole page full of them. So these not only help you define the problem, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but they're also helping you gather data. So as somebody's telling you about their situation, these are some questions you can ask. You can walk through the PDI, the personal data inventory form that was on page... Let's see. On page 27, the 5 questions that were on page 31. So what I'm saying is use all those questions. Think about how would we gather data? What questions would we ask? When you walk through that case study, what do you immediately need to understand about their circumstances, about their situation? What additional information would you want to know and learn? Okay? If you have questions, ask. Go.